And welcome to our fourth installment of the Thursday Night Theology, or as I think the new title should be, Packing a Semester's Worth of Information Somehow in Under an Hour and a Half. But tonight I really have tried, so we should be at our hour limit tonight. Tonight's topic is exploring the plausibility of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. And at the end, we'll throw in just a little bit of the conquest of Canaan, mostly because if people are going to leave Egypt, they have to go somewhere. So I don't want to just leave you mid-story. So the Exodus story has been used for many things. It can be used as a discussion for God acting in history, or highlighting Israel's special relationship with the deity. Think of the Jews and their chosenness. We can talk about liberation or redemption theology, which has been very popular in South America the past few decades. Was also a topic very popular for the southern slaves in America, the slaves being released from the oppressors, the Israelites, from the Egyptians. Or you can think of it in a political covenant relationship as the pilgrims coming to America, setting their covenant with the deity. And several other kinds of topics. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the historicity, or what data have we found, can we uncover outside of the Bible to demonstrate the plausibility of such an event, the Israelites leaving Egypt during the Exodus. So tonight we'll be looking not as historians, but we're not going to be try to downplay the miracles. I'm not going to say there was no burning bush, because today we don't experience burning bushes. That's the point of the miracle, that it's out of the ordinary. It's something that cannot be proven historically. It's something that we allow for. So tonight we're neither going to be denying the miracles or avoiding them. They're just simply not part of our topic. We'll be looking at other aspects of the Exodus from Egypt. Tonight what we'll be doing is, instead of looking at the plagues and the nature or structure of the plagues, the miraculous nature of the plagues, or the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, tonight we'll look at the archaeological evidence, the logical evidence that the biblical texts provide, as well as what inscriptional evidence we can find in Egypt and in Canaan in the surrounding time of the Exodus story. I'll skip that. All right, so instead of dissecting the miracles, an even easier or better task is what does the evidence suggest outside of the Bible, that what could have happened, what makes sense, what could or could not happen. So unlike previous texts previous lectures where we've studied the sources or textual history of biblical texts or traditions growing out of the Bible, tonight we're looking at a very different tradition, looking at the material of the world outside of the Bible during the time of the Bible. So with this in mind, we'll explore the plausibility of Exodus from Egypt, wilderness wanderings, and the conquest of Canaan. And we'll look at the diverse points put together as we talk about this phenomenon. All right, so again, tonight the main point is plausibility. It's not a simple, did the Exodus happen? Was there proof that we can uncover an Exodus from Egypt? Because there are no historical records or textual evidence from Egypt saying that Hebrew slaves or Israelite slaves left in a large group. If you think about it, if you're a king from Egypt, that's the last thing you would write down, even if it did happen. So the absence of evidence in this case is definitely not evidence of absence. No king is going to brag about losing a giant population of slaves. Similarly, because much of our evidence for Israel's living in the delta area of Egypt is a very marshy, wet land, we would not expect text to survive from the marsh like we would expect text to survive in a desert. So, again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. These in and of themselves do not negate the possibility or plausibility of the Exodus story. But for lack of these textual evidences, we will look at historical evidence, other larger migration patterns in the area, and other events and data that we can glean from the Egyptian records. So we need to know when the Exodus took place if we're going to make sense of when the populations would have been present in Egypt to leave. If we follow 1 Kings chapter 6:1, which places us in the time of Solomon, the son of David, about the year 966 BC, we have an explanation in contrast in time to the Exodus. So Kings 6:1, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So we can fairly confidently date the beginning of Solomon's reign to the mid-10th century, so give or take the year 966 BC. If we add 480 years to that, that would give us a date of 1446, so almost 500 years prior. The problem with that date is we know from historical records from Egypt and from Palestine and elsewhere, or Canaan and elsewhere, that Egypt actually controlled Canaan during the 15th century and the 14th century. So the idea that a group of people would have left Egypt, wandered through the desert, and then entered the land of Canaan some time later, potentially 40 years later, only to find themselves in a land that is occupied by Egyptian forces, is not a celebratory story. That's like the prisoner digging out of his cell and only winding up digging into the warden's office. It's not something that you celebrate year in and year out for the rest of your history as a people. So for this reason, our clearest evidence of 1 Kings 6:1 is not something to depend upon in dating the Exodus. And moreover, knowing the significance of biblical numbers, 480 is the number 12, which is a very biblical and a very Israel dozen. Along times the number 40, which is a year of trial, or a number of trial. So you take these two idealized numbers together, you get 480, in and of itself suspect as far as historical data go. So we need to come up with some time other than 1446. However, about this same time, sometime in the second millennium, before the Israelites can leave, we need for them to arrive. So what we'll turn now to, before we come up with a final date for an Exodus, is to come up for a plausibility of arrival. And here, according to Genesis 47 and Exodus chapter 1, the Israelites, or the sons and children of Jacob, settled in the land of Ramses and Pithom, and in the land of Goshen, which seems to be somewhere in the northeast or eastern side of the delta, in very lower Egypt. And just to remind you, lower Egypt is northern Egypt, in contrast to upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt. So the biblical text suggests a delta area for our Israelites, and again, they would not have left any written evidence behind, or at least it would not have survived in a delta marshy climate. However, unlike the Israelites or Jacob and his clan, we do have evidence of other Western Asiatic peoples relocating to Egypt. In particular, and perhaps the most famous, is the so-called Hyksos dynasty, or the 17th dynasty that ruled in Egypt. These were actually an Asiatic people, and they ruled in the north. If you see the capital, Avaris there, very distinct from Memphis or Cairo, much to the south. And they seem to have ruled during the 17th and 16th centuries BC. We call them the 17th dynasty of Egypt. However, their reign or their rule corresponds with the 15th and 16th dynasties of Egypt that are to the south, closer to Thebes and Memphis. So there was a kind of concurrent rather than unified rule of Egypt in these times. But they were an Asiatic people. They did take on titles like Pharaoh, or titles that led on that they were foreign, as though they were fake pharaohs or pretender pharaohs of the like. So what people do because of this Hyksos dynasty, they say, if this is 17th or 16th century, that is far enough away from Solomon that you have however many years between Solomon and the Exodus, and however many years between the Exodus and Jacob and Joseph and their family. They say this could have been a time when a Joseph character or a Joseph-like character that we know from Genesis might have come to Egypt and risen in power, because the Pharaoh in the area would have been sympathetic to Asiatic people, being Asiatic themselves. Again, we have no evidence, textual evidence from Egypt that the Jacob and the Joseph that we know from Genesis rose to power, but this does lend an air of plausibility to such a story. And again, whether you want to date Joseph 400 years prior to the Exodus, 430 years prior to the Exodus, or 4 generations prior to the Exodus, because the Bible gives all 3 sets of data, is up to you, however you might make sense of that when a Joseph or Joseph-like character would have been. So there's reason to suspect Asiatic people like the Israelites would have made it to Egypt in the first place. Here's a drawing from a wall painting of an individual named Ben Hassan. As you see, this dates from the early 19th century BC, from 1890. And what's of interest here, well, there's actually 2 things. First, you see a representation of Western Asiatic people. Their headbands on the women, and then you see for the men a distinctive West Semitic tight linear beard here on this individual there. So this is a style that we can recognize as Asiatics. They're not necessarily from Canaan, they're not necessarily from what we'll call Israel. They could be the area that's Moab or the Transjordan, or just somewhere in that general area. We also have textual evidence instead of just the inscription, or just instead of the picture. We have in the hieroglyphics this individual is captive with his hands tied behind his back, and he's on his knees in submission. That is the hieroglyphic symbol for Western Asiatic. So here we have an actual representation visually and textually of these people. And so here the text on this on what I've got here as our second register, it says, "The arrival, bringing stibium," which is a mineral for eye cosmetics, bringing stibium with 37 Asiatics brought to him. So you see the Asiatic determinative, and then if you count these hoops or H-looking things, each one of those is 10, and you add those lines, you have your 37. So again, Western Semitic people in Egypt at a time maybe a little earlier than where we would place Joseph, but analogous to Joseph all the same. We also have a text that's dated from either the 20th or maybe as late as the 18th century. It's a long prophecy, and if you don't mind, I'll read it in full, plus the part that's actually on the board. He will take the white crown. This is a reference to the king and the glory days that will come in the future. He will take the white crown. He will wear the red crown. He will unite two mighty ones. He will satisfy the two lords with what they desire. The encircler of the fields will be in his grasp, the orb. Rejoice, ye people of his time. The Son of Man will make his name forever and ever. They who incline toward evil and who plot rebellion have subdued their speech for fear of him. So the enemies will keep quiet. The Asiatics will fall to his sword, and the Libyans will fall to his flame. The rebels belong to his wrath, and the treacherous heart to the awe of him. The serpent which is on his brow stills for him the treacherous of heart. So again, the enemy will submit and be fearful. And then here, there will be built the wall of the ruler, life, prosperity, health, and the Asiatics will not be permitted to come down into Egypt, that they might beg for water in the customary manner, in order to let their beasts drink. And justice will come into its place, while wrongdoing is driven out. Rejoice, he who may behold this, and who may be in the service of the king. The learned man will pour out water for me, when he sees what I have spoken come to pass. So here, there's a long diatribe against foreigners, not just the Western Asiatics, but also the Libyans to the west. But what you notice, the idea that Asiatics will not be permitted to come down and beg for water, and not just for themselves, but also for their beasts. This is very much reminiscent of what we know from Genesis, that Jacob and his family, their motive to going to Egypt was because of a famine, the need for food, and the need for water. So, again, I'm not saying that this is talking about Jacob and his clan. I'm saying it's presenting a similar story, or at least a plausibility, as that is tonight's key term. We also have evidence of Asiatic slaves in Egypt, much like the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, already in the 18th century. And you'll see here on this list, again, this is from the mid-18th century, so earlier than our Exodus, earlier than where we might put a plausible Joseph. But the red names, and these are just a few select lines from this very long list, are West Semitic names. Names that would have represented people living in Canaan during the second millennium. And you'll notice, I'm sure many of you know the name Ashur, who is one of Jacob's sons by Zilpah, the handmaiden of Leah, and perhaps just as intriguing is the name Shepra in line 21. The Asiatic woman Shepra, she is called Seneb Henuet's weaver of linen. This is significant because this is the same name of one of the midwives in Exodus 1, chapter 15. When the Israelites or the Hebrew slaves have grown too populous, the Pharaoh tells the midwives to throw the baby boys into the water after they're born. And Shifra is one of the names given for the midwives. The other one's Puah. So, again, I'm by no means saying that this 18th century Shipra is the same woman that we encounter in Exodus 1, but the population is very similar. So, establishing this plausibility that Western Asiatics, or perhaps future Israelites, would have been in this region at the time. Jumping forward in time to about the 15th century, which, if we were to follow 1 Kings 6, would place the Exodus itself, we have a representation here of slaves, both Libyan slaves and Western Asiatic slaves, building bricks from mud and straw. And the individual that's circled, again, we see he's got that Western Asiatic beard, the very thin-lined beard, plus the goatee of sorts. And, of course, he's got the lighter skin representation compared to the Nubians and the Libyans that are also found on this picture. Inscriptions that are found alongside this picture make reference, they say, captives whom his majesty thought or brought for works of the temple of Ammon. The taskmaster, he says to the builders, the rod is in my hand, do not be idle. So very reminiscent of the taskmasters in Exodus telling the Israelites or the Hebrew slaves to hurry up and make more brick. This text is from Karnak, which is in Thebes, which is several hours away from Cairo, much less the Delta, where we would posit the Israelites to be. But again, we're looking at plausibility, not direct evidence tonight. Let's see. Oh, it's also worth noting that the brick making using the mud and the straw together is an Egyptian method of making brick. This is not something a native Canaanite would do in Canaan. So this is not something that's simply imagined. It reflects a reality of life in Egypt rather than in the home country of Canaan. So whatever it was, there seems to be some historical memory adding to this plausibility that's added to the story. Another text, and this dates to mid-June 1215 BC, which, as I'll suggest later, is about the same time as our best guess, give or take a decade, perhaps, about the same time as our best guess for a potential Israelite exodus from Egypt. But here the text says, another information for my Lord, that we may have just let the Shasu tribes of Edom, this is another Western Asiatic people, a people separate from the Israelites and Canaanites, we've just let them pass from the fortress of Merneptah, Hetep, Ma'at, life, prosperity, and health of Jeku, to the pool of Per Atum, or the house of Atum, of Merneptah, Hetep, Ma'at of Jeku, in order to revive themselves and revive their flocks from the great life force of Pharaoh, the perfect son of every land, in the third year, or the 8th year, the 3rd day, in the birth of Seth. This is not a letter that's written for informative purposes. As you see in my little note there at the bottom of the screen, this is a letter that the schoolboy scribes would be practicing for their writing lessons. So somehow this phenomenon of, here in this case, the Shasu people of Edom was stereotypical enough of this idea that they would be slaves or that they would be escaping from Pharaoh's way, that this became the grammar instruction for how to write your Egyptian lessons. So this is something that's being programmed into the minds as very representative. The Western Asiatics tried to escape. In this case, a Bedouin-like people. And we also have another text from about this same time, and also from Memphis, that makes reference to escaped laborers or escaped slaves. And they even give the location. I was sent from the broad halls of the king's house, life, prosperity, and health, on the 3rd month of the 3rd season, day 9, at the time of the evening, after those 2 workers, which is to say, the escapees. When I reached the fortress of Jeku on the 3rd month of the 3rd season, day 10, they told me, they are reporting from the south that they had passed on the 3rd month of the 3rd season, day 10. So he's tracking them. And when I reached the fort, they told me, the groom has come from the desert, saying, they have passed the wall of the tower of Seti Merneptah, an individual who reigned earlier in the 13th century. Life, prosperity, health, beloved like Seth. So again, story that reminds us of the Israelite exodus from Egypt, even if it doesn't confirm. As I said, nothing, no textual evidence outside of Exodus will actually confirm the Exodus account. Because it either, by point of pride, you're not going to record it, or if something had been written down, it would not have survived. But if you think about it, we do have historical parallels similar to not just these small reports of one or two laborers or one or two Bedouin escaping Egypt. We do have historical comparisons. For example, Spartacus in the 1st century BC, from 73 to 71, he was a gladiator. He led about 70,000 slaves in revolt away from Rome. And had he not been betrayed by the pirate ship that he hired to take them to Sicily, they might have fared better in the end. But they were still on the run for about a year and a half, 2 years, before the 70,000 slaves escaped and were finally attacked and defeated. So again, a large mass of people that are enslaved people can escape from their overlords, maybe not forever, but at least for a long period of time. So, as I'll mention later, we're not going to allow for 2.5 million Hebrews to have escaped from Exodus, like the Exodus tradition and the Book of Numbers would have us believe, but still, a sizable number is not historically unprecedented. So I mentioned earlier the idea that we don't know when the Exodus would have happened. I said 1446 was definitely not accurate because you're not going to leave only to end up in the land of Canaan and be subjugated to Egypt yet again. Continuing down between the 15th, the 14th, and then now the 13th century, Egypt's power will wax and wane, and its influence and sphere of influence will grow and shrink in Canaan. But Ramses the Great, or Ramses II, actually went through and conquered Moab and the Transjordan area in 1275 to 1260. And he had battled the Hittites in Kadesh, which is in Syria, north of Canaan, about this same time. And as part of the truce that they drew with each other, Ramses maintained control over Canaan. So we can now say the Exodus would not have happened prior to the mid-13th century, because again, you leave Egypt, you end up in your Egyptian overlord's occupied territory just across the way. However, there are some interesting data related to Ramses that may help us place maybe not the Exodus itself, but maybe the moment of enslavement or the idea of the moment of enslavement. Because Ramses was a great builder, and we know that the Israelites were supposed to be building. This is why they knew about the mud bricks. So the reputation of the king had taken a great hit in the muck that had been the Queen Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, and Akhenaten, if you've heard of him, he's the pharaoh who created a kind of pseudo-monotheism in Egypt, and then his son, King Tut, Tutankhamun, reversed all these decisions. So a lot of turmoil in the 18th dynasty was going on. Respect was being lost for the king, for Pharaoh. And so in the 19th dynasty, Ramses II, he has to inflate his ego and his reputation among the people. And in doing so, he did massive work projects. And so he may have built cities, or had cities built to the north in the Delta area, perhaps Ramses and Pitom, like we saw mentioned in Exodus. Pitom, it just sounds like a foreign word to us, but it actually in Egyptian means house or temple of the god Atum. And we do have stele and data from the north in the Delta region talking about Atum, the lord of the region, Theku. And Theku is probably the Egyptian equivalent of the Hebrew word Sukkot, which is a geographic name located in the northern Egypt delta. So we might have had this reference, Atum, Lord of Theku, as comparable to the idea Pitom and Sukkot in Exodus. So again, plausibility, not proof that the Israelites were actually there. Moreover, Ramses, because of his great building projects, was very renowned or regarded in infamy, depending on your point of view, as someone who exploited corvée or forced labor for the states, especially when it came to foreigners. So if there was going to be a Pharaoh, as Exodus 1 puts it, who did not know Joseph and therefore enslaved Jacob's descendants, if there was going to be one, Ramses II, Ramses the great builder, would be an ideal candidate. So this would put, and again, he's still ruling Canaan at least midway into the 13th century, so this would put a potential exodus of Israelites from Egypt sometime in the second half of the 12th century, which is a good 200 years different from anything that 1 Kings 6 would put us, not even a full 300 years from Solomon's temple building. If Ramses II was the potential pharaoh of enslavement, it could be his son and successor, Merneptah, who would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, if it was not a very old and weakened Ramses himself prior to the year 1213. Merneptah's health was not well. He was weak as a king. He did not rule but a decade, or just around a decade. So politically, there would have been a lot of instability at this time, allowing for a people to disappear. So this is part of the reason Merneptah, if it's not Ramses himself, who is both the enslaver and the guy who loses his slaves, Merneptah is our next best possibility as the pharaoh of the Exodus. This is the character about the 10 plagues that you think of from the movies would be based on this actor. However, while the Egyptians are no longer ruling Canaan at this time, by the end of the 13th century, Merneptah actually sets an expedition, a military campaign into Canaan around the year 1208, give or take, and he claims to have conquered many of the peoples in Canaan, and curiously enough, he mentions the name Israel. So in this so-called Merneptah inscription from the year 1208 BC, we find our first extra-biblical attestation of the name Israel. So let me read a little bit of this inscription. Part of this stele is actually here near the bottom as he winds up. But he says, "Plundered is Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gezer. Yanoam is made as that which does not exist. Israel is laid waste. His seed is not." Zooming in, and again, we're at the bottom of this text, but if you zoom in, you can see the line, Israel, its seed is not. Hopefully the lighting, you can see how these hieroglyphs have been outlined in black. But we see here in the circled aspect, it's a woman sitting down and a man sitting down. This is a hieroglyphic symbol to tell the reader that we're talking about a people. The Egyptians, in their hieroglyphic writings, they had symbols that would indicate the next word or next letters represent a god or a place or a political entity. Significantly, Gezer and Ashkelon and Yanoam are referred to as political entities. Israel is referred to as a people or an ethnic entity, and specifically not a political unified body, which if we're about 200 years prior to King David, prior to King Solomon, and we have our best guess from biblical narratives would be the 12 tribes living in Israel as a confederacy, but not as a unified people. This designation as people rather than politic seems to fit what we know about the Israelites from this period. Curiously, and there's now been a new way to identify this translation. Typically, when we see a phrase from ancient world that says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not, this looks to be a reference to the extinction of a people, which is to say there will be no offspring of Israel. So curiously, our first mention of Israel says Israel will be no more. A bit of irony, or at least oddness as it is. A recent interpretation has said its seed is not, is in reference to some kind of scorched earth policy that Merneptah might have employed, attacking the people. So it's not killing them off, he's just making their next couple years of crops a total failure. But either way, this is our earliest evidence of the word Israel, which, although it matches what we know of Israel as a political or non-political body during the time of Judges, if Israel had just left Egypt during Merneptah's reign, not even 5 years prior, here they are already in the middle of the land of Canaan. So they either got there a lot faster than the book of Exodus and Numbers lets on, or they were there all along. And here, again, another image of a Western Asiatic with the beard and then a headband as well. You see the route that Merneptah claims to have taken, or his campaign is going, starting out in Ashkelon, which is in modern Gaza, up to Gezer, which is halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as a quick estimate. No one's really sure where Yanoam is, so our authors plot maybe it's somewhere near around the Sea of Galilee, and then it comes back full circle, the idea Israel is being here, where maybe the city Shechem is, or modern Nablus, or the highlands of Ephraim and Manasseh's tribes. So that's the best guess as to what Merneptah was talking about in the year 1208. So whether they left during Merneptah or right prior to Merneptah, or somebody left during Merneptah's reign or right prior to Merneptah, they're there, or somebody is there, by the time Merneptah explores Canaan, having lost control of the land a little bit prior. So this leaves us then, how did one population get from Egypt to Canaan? Traditionally, and this goes back to at least the 3rd century of the Christian era, if not earlier, you see the dot here at the bottom of the Sinai. This is the traditional location of Mount Sinai, or the mountain of Moses, in which case Israel goes around, wanders around up in the delta for a while. If you recall from Exodus 14, they backtrack multiple times and then finally go down in the cross. Exodus tells us that the Philistines were in the land, which would be here in Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon. If the Philistines are in the land, or the way of the Philistines as it's described, the Philistines don't arrive in Canaan until the year until the year 1180, which is definitely about a generation after our Merneptah stele from 1208. So either that's anachronistic, or the story is telling a later Exodus that does not coincide with our Merneptah king as the Exodus king. But Migdol to the north, this northern route, the Red Route, it was probably too fortified and dangerous on account of Egyptian interests. So this is why the southern route is the more popular idea. A few things to say about the wilderness wanderings, and because there's no evidence from the wilderness, nothing archaeological dates to the 12th or 13th century to correspond to the wilderness wanderings of the Israelite people. There's no architecture that's been left behind. There are no bones that date to this period. There's no waste or trash or other significant findings. The desert is a harsh climate, so it in part makes sense that we're not going to have any data, but it's very difficult. Again, if we follow Exodus chapter 12 and 13 and 14, it mentions in Exodus 12:37 that there were 600,000 able-bodied Israelite men, which, if we allow for a wife and a family, on average, that would put us at about 2.5 million Israelites leaving the Exodus in our story. In the year 1798, which was to say just over 200 years ago, Egypt along the Nile had a population of about 2 million people. Archaeologists speculate that ancient Egypt in the 13th century, the time of a plausible exodus, would have had a population of about 2.8 million. There's no way that 2.8 million people would have lived there, 2.5 of them being Israelite slaves. So for this reason alone, we have to allow for the possibility or the fact that this number 600,000 able-bodied men is highly inflated. Another reason that we can assume that this number is inflated is because if you take 10 men across and have them march, this would be a length of march that would span 150 miles. And it would take about a week for a full group to march past a given point. So this is not a crowd that could make it through the Reed Sea or the Red Sea overnight. This is not a crowd that's plausible. At the turn of the 19th century, again, of the Common Era, the Christian era, estimates put the Bedouin population living in the Sinai at about 5,000. And today there are about 40,000 Bedouin living in the Sinai Peninsula. And they're actually leaving behind artifacts, which the Bedouin are very good at living in the desert. They've been doing it for a very long time. So the idea that they're going to leave artifacts behind, whereas a significantly large number of Israelites could not or do not leave any archaeological evidence behind, again suggests that this 600,000 men or 2.5 million Israelites is a grossly exaggerated number, whatever this number might have been. One thing to add to it, I mentioned brick making was the Egyptian way to build rather than a Canaanite way to build. It's also worth noting that the name Moses is an Egyptian name. The name Aaron, the high priest, Moses' brother, is an Egyptian name. Aaron's grandson Phineas, a later high priest, is an Egyptian name. So there's a historical memory of people from Egypt, perhaps even Egyptians, as might be the case, or Western Asiatics taking on local names. We do have a tradition of Egyptian people leaving that land with names reflecting the land from which they left. But again, we have no evidence of where they went, how they went, or where they got from place A to place B, when exactly that might have happened. The last few minutes of the lecture today, we have the Israelites, or some group of people, leaving Egypt, presumably sometime in the late 13th century. We have no possible route that they could have taken, at least they've left no evidence behind for them to have what path they took, but somehow, about this same time, in the late 13th century, we do have an influx of population in Canaan itself. If you're familiar with the book of Joshua, which records the biblical conquests, we have here in Joshua 12, 9 through 24, a list of 31 cities that the Israelites attacked and conquered with the help of Yahweh, their deity. Unfortunately, modern archaeology, most of these surveys took place in the early 20th century and have been reevaluated since. But of these 31, only 3 seem to correspond so that those cities were actually destroyed in the 13th century. And these 2 are Hatzor, which is to the north, just above the Sea of Galilee. And then we have Bethel, which is kind of in the southern highlands near Ephraim and Manasseh's area. And finally, we have Lachish, which is to the south. All 3 of these, we have destruction levels in the late 13th century. It seems, and many scholars and archaeologists are willing to say, that Hatzor and Shechem, or Bethel, it should be Bethel on the slide, not Shechem. Hatzor and Bethel could have been destroyed and reconquered and occupied by an Israelite people. Lachish, on the other hand, our most southern of these 3 cities, is on the border of the Philistine people's land, and so archaeologists seem to think that Egyptians had Canaanites living there, and they ruled over the Canaanites, or potentially Philistines were living there. So whatever destruction that happens to Lachish in the late 13th century, they do not think can be attributed to the Israelite people. So 2 out of the 31 cities that Joshua lists are potentially cities that were conquered by people that arrive into Canaan about the same time as we think a group of people might have potentially left from Egypt. To highlight this a little bit more, the creativity that the Joshua account has, the most famous story in Joshua is the Battle of Jericho. The idea that Jericho had these massive walls, city walls to protect the city, and it was a very fortified and heavily populated place. Unfortunately, for the 13th century, when we would expect this conquest to happen, we have a very small population living in Jericho, and it's not a fortified city. It's an unfortified village. Another famous story is the Battle of Ai. This is a story in Joshua chapter 8, where the Israelites, having just fit the battle of Jericho, expect that they can easily win the Battle of Ai. They fail, and then they try again once the problem is solved as to what happened. Interestingly enough, the name Ai is the Hebrew word for ruins, or ruin mound, which is to say, this is the place that's not occupied. And the last major occupation of the city Ai was in the year 2400. So long before the Exodus, long before the conquest, 1,000 years before Moses, and even before a potential Joseph, or even before Abraham, was the last time the city of Ai would have been occupied. There is a small village that lives there from 1200 to 1050 BC, but this is later than we generally give for the probable Canaanite conquest by any Israelite people. So even if we have destruction layers that don't match with the supposed conquest of Canaan by Joshua and his countrymen, and we only have maybe Hatzor and Bethel as the cities that were occupied or destroyed and taken over by Israel, we do have a significant population growth taking place in Israel at this time. the 13th century is the end of the Late Bronze Age. The 10th century is the beginning of what's called the Iron Age. So think of King David as the king of the Iron Age, and think of the judges as rulers during the Late Bronze Age. This here, if you see the triangles, either black triangles or the white triangles, this here represents population settlements in the Late Bronze Age, or primarily in the Late Bronze Age. Again, the period of Judges. Some surveys of some different 88 sites from the Late Bronze Age have yielded a potential population in one area of about 50,000 people. If you move to the early Iron Age, those 88 sites have now become almost 700 sites, 93% of which were created just during the Iron Age. So over the course of a couple hundred years, there's this massive influx of population. What had been 50,000 people in the Late Bronze Age is now 150,000 people in the same general area in the early Iron Age. And as you see, just comparing our two maps, the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, you see an increase in settlements just visually for as far away as we are from the overhead. And comparing this side by side, you see there is a significantly larger settlement pattern in the Iron Age or the time of David. Think maybe the time of Solomon, the divided kingdom, the north and the south, contrast to the Judges period. So if there were 50,000 people for our samples that we're taking in the Late Bronze Age, there's 150,000 people living during the Iron Age, just a couple hundred years at most later. This is too large of a population growth, or too fast of a population growth in the time to be just natural population growth. There has to have been some outside community entering Canaan to make for this difference. We can't allow just for people having more kids. There was better farming. We do have evidence of a new type of farming going on, more of a tiered side of the hill farming that allows for more crop per acre. There's also new houses, new tiles, new textiles, new jars, so perhaps suggestive of a new ethnic people. But this is going on all throughout the area, not just in Canaan itself. This is also happening in Moab, and Ammon, and Edom, and to the north as well. So where these people are coming from is beyond us. Some seem to be Arameans from the north. We know that the Philistines came from Greece. They're in the Gaza area. But where the rest of the people come from the northwest and from the east is a little bit more problematic. So this increase in population, even if it's not a conquest and replacement of a native Canaanite people, we do have an inflated population suddenly in the early Iron Age. So whoever left Egypt during the Exodus, whatever size that was, which we can't say, although we can say it's not 600,000 people, much less 2.5 million people. Some people from Egypt may have corresponded to this growth that we have here in Canaan at approximately the same time. And they seem to have been united eventually as a Yahwistic people, or a super tribe collection of people that worship the Yahweh, or the deity Yahweh. And from biblical tradition, we know that Moses introduces Yahweh to the Israelites. So it does seem plausible that whatever population left Israel, or left Egypt, encountered Yahweh, and then introduced Yahweh to the native Canaanite peoples, supplemented the native Canaanite population, and then became unified as one Israelite, Yahwistic people. Sometime by the beginning of the Iron Age, say King David, King Solomon, or King Saul. And I'll skip that for tonight. So that's basically the story. We have no evidence textual. We don't expect evidence from a textual source. We have no evidence of wilderness wanderings in the Sinai, and we have this increase of population that we don't have a best explanation for, but we know it's not natural growth going on in Canaan at the same time as a potential exodus going on. So people got somehow from point A to point B, and we know where that point B is, in Canaan, but we don't know exactly who or where point A was. But the exodus, in some sense, is plausible, even if it's a smaller scale than the biblical tradition. So that's the talk for tonight. Next month we'll be back on the third Thursday, so May 15th. We'll be doing something slightly different yet again. Rather than looking at biblical sources or biblical history or early biblical interpretation, we'll be doing a very modern, 21st century, very Arkansas-based interpretation of the Bible. Tony Alamo's legal team called me a few years ago asking for biblical and early Christian evidence in support of polygamy in Christian tradition and in support of child brides. I told them I could offer no help, but they gave me their literature anyway, so I had something from which to read and respond. And so I've worked this up into an article, and now next month we'll look at it as a lecture, and then we'll entitle it The Anomaly of Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, a New Testament-based call for Christian polygamy, or in a good Rocky and Bullwinkle fashion, how I kept Alamo's freedom of religion defense out of federal court. So that will be our talk next month.